I think it's harder to tell a story that has, go back to what I've used too many times now, authenticity with big brands, because people have a preconceived idea of what that brand is in their mind. It's easier as a strategist who's trying to create sort of reasonably interesting ideas. It's easier to work with a Rover than it is with an IBM, right? Well, because you tend to have the founders are involved, and you can get the real passion of why the thing has been created, that you can then tell really interesting stories. I already know, because I guarantee when people watched our Starbucks ad on Sunday and saw what we were doing, they automatically talked about tax, right? Because you can't not talk about Starbucks and some of the challenges they have had with their tax system, and you have to kind of face head on into that. But it does make it harder, and I think the thing we're talking about in terms of not only is IBM massive, it's also very established. so it's very difficult to try and change people's perceptions of that over time. And you do it by some of the stuff that I think John's referring to. It's about consistency of the story arc over a longer period of time.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. I would agree. It does get hard. The bigger your company, the harder the challenge of storytelling and taking risks and changing things and mixing things up and playing with the format, like I said earlier. But the large corporations are changing, right? They're responding to all those trends that we talked about earlier, and I think they recognize that they have to change. They are mixing things up. They're focusing on like micro stories we spoke about, like instead of just changing the entire story and having one story, having lots of little stories and breaking them into bits and pieces, which I think is a good shift. So. Traditionally, yes, hard to tell a story if you're a large corporation, but large corporations are changing. If you look at how they behave now to how they behaved 10 years ago, it's a very different type of profile, and I think we were more flexible as a large corporation than we were.
The trick is to not give up, right?
Yeah.
Because when it's a bigger corporation, it just takes longer to filter through. But as soon as you give up as the initiator of the story, then it'll just go into nothing. Or if you quickly change it because you think it's not getting anywhere, we should do this instead, then everyone needs to kind of, like an old tanker, go to this new story. And you just kind of keep consistency. I don't work at Boots now, but I did before. And that is a massive organisation, right? Huge. And I don't know whether you've seen, but they've finally started to drop the Boots 1980s lozenge logo and go back to the...
Boutique it is now.
The Boots boutique now, yeah, exactly, and really go back to their heritage.
Yeah.
And leverage. It's a 165, now 67-year-old company. It invented ibuprofen. By the way, it invented ibuprofen. It's mad to think about that. And it's got a huge, long history. And I was actually digging around in the archives. They're really cold, by the way, in Boots, and looking at all the stuff and saying, guys, when you think about where do you need to go in the future, you go back to the past. There was some slide about nostalgia, and if you do have a long brand history, take a look at it. And there's often some gems in there. Look at where Kellogg have gone with their packaging as well. A bit red. I think it looks awesome on shelf, and they've realised that there's a long brand history. You might not have it, and that's also fine, but you make your own story, and if it's authentic and there. And I just think, when I think about this oil tanker of Boots, this change from dropping that 1980s blue lozenge and going back to the roots was the work I did 4 years ago. And it's only just coming to life now because it's a place with 2,500 stores. It's got 100,000 employees. It's absolutely ginormous. It just takes a really long time, just commitment to see it through, and there'll be so many like naysayers internally before you get to that external thing. But if it's the right thing for the brand, it'll happen. Just be committed.
I think the heritage thing is interesting when you work for a business that is a new business, but also a new category.
Yeah.
The story that you're telling is not just the story of Rover, it's the story of the invention of a category that didn't exist before. And that is interesting, especially in our US part of the brand, because we have a competitor that is very tarnishing to that category. So they're in the press a lot for the wrong reasons, whereas we're in the press for the right reasons. But the damage that does to a new concept can be quite damning, because if you're trying to teach people about this new thing, they're like, oh, but is that a bit like this other brand that does that? And you have to say, yes, but we're good, and it's really difficult to have that brand story out there when somebody else is out there, the nemesis of that brand story, telling a bad version of it. And you don't have the heritage there. You're new, but you're a new category altogether. So you're teaching people. And that's the thing about brand awareness too, in that sense, because you're not just trying to raise awareness of one brand. You're trying to raise awareness of a service that people don't even know exists yet. Just like if you told somebody 20 years ago, oh, you'll take your phone out of your pocket, and when you want to go, you'll just jump in a stranger's car, and he'll take you. And then if you really like that guy, you'll just mark him out of 5 stars. I mean, it goes against everything your mum ever taught you about getting into a stranger's car. But we all do it now as second nature, and it didn't exist before.
But to Jonathan's point, you can have an enemy or something to rail against, right? And that's your story. It's like, we're different because.
Yeah, definitely.
And just to finish off, I do think you get lots of signs right now where large companies are actively trying to kind of dismantle the aura of being a large company and trying to behave like small companies. I think the Boots thing is an example, right? It's like trying to go back to like an earlier time when it was a small boutique, right? And there are, we find this as well, and it goes back to that CEO point as well, that the type of people running companies are much more accessible than they were 10 years ago. And just to use Microsoft again as another example, which I think is quite interesting. So they've launched a series of marketing videos on YouTube where there are interviews with Microsoft customers, and the guy doing the interview, acting as the reporter, is the CEO of Microsoft, is Satya Nadella, right? So he becomes the humble reporter going out into the field, asking customers, so how's it going? What's your business? What are you trying to achieve? How are you working, with Microsoft? And so he's become the humble reporter, and that's an interesting kind of shift, right? Before, he'd be the kind of guy on the pedestal talking about how great his company is. Yeah, Steve Ballmer, who's a completely different character. Now you get this much more accessible, ordinary, guy who's like, an immigrant who's come from, it's actually trained, schooled in India and has kind of done good despite the impossible. He's gone through this story arc himself, and there is a vogue for these kind of characters right now. Our own new CEO also has the same kind of story arc that is so popular these days. So I think large companies are actively dismantling the kind of vestiges of being a large company, and I think that's an interesting point.
Doing an activity like that shows a vulnerability
Yeah.
as well, and the vulnerability is what leads to authenticity in that brand. People that are willing to show we don't have all the answers. We're we're open to that constructive feedback, and we're vulnerable.
Yeah, it's Nemo with the small fin, or Frodo with this size challenge, right? It's this, and they are the great characters. They are the great stories. They're the best stories. I think worth remembering.